Thank you, and a very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here for this special event at the Capitol tonight for a most timely conversation featuring Jason Stanley on fascism. My name is Erin Vincent and I'm the CEO of the Wheeler Centre, and I'd like to acknowledge we are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise the continuous culture and tradition of storytelling on these lands. Jason Stanley is an internationally recognised expert on fascism and the best-selling author of How Fascism Works, and it's great to see his books are almost sold out there, so there's a few copies left if you want to grab one later. He writes and speaks widely on authoritarianism, propaganda, free speech and mass incarceration. And earlier this year, he made the bold decision to relocate himself and his family from the United States to Canada in protest of the Trump administration's attacks on civil liberties. And it seems he's not alone. A report in The Guardian today revealed at least 29 US citizens have sought asylum in Australia in the first 6 months of Trump's second presidency. Tonight, Jason will be in conversation with our host, Sarah Schwartz, a human rights lawyer and co-founding executive officer of the Jewish Council of Australia. Together, they will explore how authoritarian regimes have manipulated history, and they'll reveal the global tactics that threaten democracy today. And given the constant wave of breaking news and challenges to freedom of speech emerging in Western democracies around the world, this conversation could not be more relevant right now. The Wheeler Centre is proud to host Jason in Melbourne. As some of you may know, our city was recognised as a UNESCO City of Literature in 2008, an acknowledgement of the breadth, depth and vibrancy of this city's literary culture. This recognition paved the way for the Wheeler Centre to be established, the Centre for Books, Writing and Ideas, which from the very beginning has been deepening public engagement with the most urgent questions of our time. And Jason and Sarah will do that again tonight. There's never been a more important time for us to lean into thought-provoking conversations where ideas can be tested and debated. We need storytelling and human perspectives now, more than ever, to connect us and build understanding. If you value these things and these conversations as much as we do, we invite you to join our community of supporters by pledging a gift to the Wheeler Centre so we can continue to host these important discussions and ensure they are open to everyone. You can make a donation on the Wheeler Centre's website at any time. Events like tonight's remind us why these conversations matter, for community, for engagement, and for the health of our democracy. It's set to be a powerful discussion, so let's get underway. Please join me in welcoming Jason Stanley and Sarah Schwartz to the stage.
Thanks so much for coming, Jason.
Thank you, Sarah, and it's an honor to be in conversation with you, given what you've done I have 2 young Jewish kids, and my Jewish people like you are great models for them. So.
As are you, thank you very much. Well, let's get into fascism. Your favorite topic.
2 Jews talking about fascism on the eve of Yom Kippur.
Well, you know, maybe in America you guys are used to speaking about fascism a lot, but I think here in Australia we're still sort of at this stage where a lot of people think that fascism is this phenomenon that's confined to the 20th century. You know, and your work, both in your previous book, How Fascism Works, and also in this book, you speak about, you know, fascism as this set of recurring political tactics, which is reshaping politics today. And so I want to start off by asking, what does fascism mean in our world today, and what brought you to write about it in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not hard to see how fascism works, sort of thinking about fascism for me, started when I was in Budapest in 2009 and then again 2010, and right after Orbán came back to power. And I saw the kinds of tactics that he used. I saw a campaign poster with Saint Stephen holding a menorah over a map, standing on top of a map of Hungary, and I asked my Hungarian friend what it meant and what the Hungarian meant, and he said, it says, Hungary will not become another Palestine. And so I was seeing the sort of attack on George Soros, I was seeing the attack on gender ideology, and I was like, whoa, that seems quite familiar. So that, and I live in the United States, which is, as you know, working on incarceration, in the words of Toni Morrison, has long had fascist solutions to national problems. The United States has the largest prison system in the world. Most states in the United States have higher incarceration rates than any country in the world other than El Salvador. West Virginia has 10 times the incarceration rate of Germany. So all of these background conditions, I already lived in a state, in a country with mass incarcerated its black population. So I knew we were ripe for someone like a Donald Trump. So that's why and then I looked across the world and I saw these movements. Bolsonaro came to power right when How Fascism Works came out. So it's a global fight we face. When the book came out in 2018, it was sort of in its nascent phase, but now I think, democracy is basically confined to countries that do not have large armies now.
When in Erasing History, you sort of, you really hone in on a particular political tactic of fascism. You sort of position the control of the historical narrative not as just this peripheral, not as peripheral to authoritarianism, but as central to it. And you write, authoritarian regimes often find history profoundly threatening. At every opportunity, these regimes find ways of erasing or concealing history to consolidate their power. Why is history such a powerful battleground for these regimes?
Well, you need to construct a mythical, pure past for, a past where, the founders of the country came and the country was sort of empty. Maybe you committed a genocide to make it empty. But the idea was you brought culture and civilization. And then you can say, look at what's ruining the culture and civilization that our great men created. What's ruining it is these memories of indigenous genocide. What's ruining it is feminism. What's ruining it is the sort of impurity of immigration. So you need to set up that mythic past, that notion of a mythic past that's pure. If you look at India, a country that is deeply tilting into fascism with BJP in power for so long, they're erasing the history of Muslim rule and Muslim influence because the idea is it's a pure Hindu past. So you need to set that sort of flat, dull, single perspective up in order to make people feel like they're losing their country.
I mean, that erasure of history is something I think we're quite familiar with in this country, and we've had our own history wars. When I went to high school, we had a prime minister who was very opposed to what he called the black armband view of history, which was the dispossession and massacres of First Nations peoples, instead favouring this sort of three cheers view of history, what he called the three cheers view, this celebratory story.
He literally called it the three cheers.
Yeah, he did, exactly. And I guess I want to speak more about that, what that mythic national past does? Like, how does that function in the present? What does it do politically?
Well, in fascist politics relies on the sense that you're losing your nation and you need a strong man to bring it back. I mean, just think of your cartoonish picture in your head of an authoritarian country. Everybody's saluting the flag. It's all about patriotism. That's what's kind of wild, is that you're seeing these fascist leaders, like in the United States, explicitly talk about, the need, well, you're just talking about it, 3 cheers education, explicitly talk about the need for patriotic education. Another bizarre extreme example was after Charlie Kirk's assassination. Many Republican politicians were calling this is our Reichstag moment, which is kind of wild because you don't want a right. That was a bad thing, the Reichstag moment. So yeah, I mean, it's wild to present history as say, we want a non-factual history. Du Bois, in the final chapter of his 1935 book, Black Reconstruction, is called The Propaganda of History. And he says something like, history is not meant to be there to boost your ego. It's meant to be a science. And so this idea that history is intentionally meant to create a fake narrative, and that politicians actually will openly say it, is kind of shocking.
And it's not just that fake narrative. There's something that gets there's something. It's not just the erasure of history. There's something that it gets replaced by.
The construction of
the construction, and you sort of speak about in your book, and you've spoken about as well, this sort of weaponization of civil rights and liberal frameworks, and that language to serve authoritarian purposes. And I'm thinking about here we've seen a lot of the language of safe spaces to sort of silence speech on Palestine, the way in which Viktor Orban says that Christians are the most persecuted group in the world. This idea of victimhood seems very central to fascist politics. And what power does that inversion hold? Why the victimhood? Why do they want to perceive of themselves as victims?
No one is a bigger whiner than the dominant group. My God, just total snowflakes. Like, oh my God, you're criticizing our ancestors. It is utterly unbearable. So yeah, I mean, it's obviously, I mean, I think we're beyond the point where pointing out hypocrisy. There's sort of a phase in fighting authoritarianism where you're like, you guys really are hypocritical. But, we're beyond that phase now. So you want to make fascist politics, ultimately fascist politics is about protecting the oligarchs and protecting the billionaire class. So you want to direct people's resentment at their own feeling of powerlessness against scapegoats, and tell them that those scapegoats, they're the ones who are responsible for you being miserable. They're the ones who are, I mean, this is very old, you want to create an identity based around race or ethno-national identity in order to say, actually, Elon Musk is white too. He's actually just like you, if you're white. Maybe he's got a few dollars more than you have, but he's just like you and he's threatened too. We're all in this together, from the non-whites streaming in. I learned in Australia that you think of Greeks and Italians as non-white, but that was new to me. So you create this bond of similarity and joint victimhood between people of the same race or the same ethno-national identity. Of course, there are some fascist countries or countries tilting into fascism like Israel today that are not there just to protect oligarchs. Partly they're there to protect Netanyahu from going to prison, but you create this ethno-national identity. And that is, and you say it's under threat, it's under existential threat. And then you create, then you get people to mobilize on behalf of the powerful people of that ethno-national group, and then view people not in that group as existential threats. And it's Darvo, you know, like, so that's the politics you face. Obviously, I mean, I don't know if you've noticed this, Sarah, but men are having a moment in the world. And so, you know, men's rights movements, which is not to say that, men are mass incarcerated in the United States at very high levels. So obviously there's lots of, men are victims of patriarchy too. But in men's rights movements, you get that sense of victimhood. Even though, of course, what you want to say is that the problems of men actually come from patriarchy. But that's not something that's not the face of the men's rights movement.
And like part of the way in which, I think a lot of men's rights activists, but a lot of the movements that you speak about are, they're harking back to this past, this past in which they were sort of not the victims, or
right.
They were sort of, and I want to just tease out that that question around, the creation of the dominant group, the ethno-national supreme group. That's also really a core component of settler colonialism, where, and you speak about this in Erasing History, the displacement of First Peoples depends on denying their histories and connection to the land. And you speak about Israel's first leaders who spoke about the land as being wasted and deserted, and that sort of national self-understanding being based on the erasure of Palestinian connection to the land, and that has a lot of parallels in the Australian context, in the US context. How is that, that colonial logic of erasure also part of this, and how does, are settler colonies prone to fascism, and if so, why?
Yeah, settler colonialism really gives you the fascist structure of and the only group that has a history is the dominant group. So Hitler says in Mein Kampf, there's three groups. There's the civilization creators, the ones that do have a history, do have civilization. There's those who just simply lack civilization. They're just kind of like, stones or Slavs in his view, who don't have a history, don't create civilization. And then there's the civilization destroyers, us. So the only group that genuinely has history is the dominant group. And this is, and so you construct the group you're trying to attack. Either, there's two ways you can enslave them and say, they're just, meant for labor. They don't have a history. They're just sort of inert. Again, this gets back to patriarchy, because I was raised with textbooks that represented history as not having any female actors, and I'm pretty sure there were some in the world. So that was pretty wild. So you represent that group, and then you represent a group that you want to destroy as civilization destroyers. So LGBTQ citizens, you'd represent them as civilizational threats. And it's interesting, I'm a professor at the Kyiv School of Economics. I'm in Kyiv twice a year, and I taught, the first time I went to Kyiv in August 2023, I taught a course on colonialism to hundreds of Ukrainians, and because I wanted to see how much they saw themselves in the kind of, Gugi wa Thiong'o picture of European colonization. And their first reaction was like, no, the Russians are the savages. We're the cultured European ones. So they responded sort of very emotionally to being told that they were supposed to be the savages. But but then I realized that Putin, the way he talks about Ukrainians, first of all, they have no history for him. There's no independent history of Ukraine. And that's part of the, and if you say there's an independent history of Ukraine, then you're an existential threat. But he actually does say that Ukraine is an existential civilizational threat in his speech on the eve of the full-scale invasion. And he says and he says Russia represents civilization. So it is the classic colonial structure. And what he means by civilization is traditional Christian values that are supposedly existentially threatened by democracy and LGBTQ rights. So that idea, so it's kind of across the board when you're when you want to dominate, you represent your group as the only group with a history, and obviously, right. I mean, like people say things like there are no LGBTQ citizens in our country and never have been. So that's similarly like, my father wrote his dissertation in Kenya in 1959 to 1962, and he would tell, and he spent 6 months at Alliance High School, one of the finest high school in Kenya, and he would talk about how these students would emerge, these Kikuyu students would emerge, knowing everything about British history, being able to rattle off the British royal families for hundreds of years, and didn't know anything about the land on which they were standing.
And so, I mean, you illustrate this point a lot, like this is not just about sort of the erasure of history, but it's about the reconstruction of the present as well. We're also talking about sort of the erasure of systems and structures and the past, and that sort of bleeds into what you describe as sort of this early battleground for fascist politics being universities and educational institutions. And we've certainly seen that, play out in the US in not such an early way, funding cuts, whole departments demolished, arrests, crackdowns on students. Why are schools and universities in particular these early battlegrounds?
Right, so when I first wrote Erasing History and was shopping it around to presses, people were like, education books don't sell. The topic now is authoritarianism. And I was like, actually, you're gonna find soon that education books do sell. You're gonna see that education is very central. It's like, and that was the first target of, that went after universities first. There's a new, every day the Trump regime does something new and exciting. So today they asked 9 universities to sign a contract, and they said, we're going to broaden this out to all universities. And one of the clauses for the compact was not to have any teaching on campus that threatens conservatives in any way. So the way I like to think about it is you have to reason backwards from the attacks to so now they're going to say anyone who calls them a fascist is a terrorist. So they're telling you we're fascists. They ban gender studies because they're like, we're using a particularly harsh version of patriarchy. Like my colleague Robin Dembroff talks about gender being a way to separate bodies, separate people for power, and that's what we're really seeing right now. So since they're employing gender as a means to divide the working class for power, not just the working class, you see this working with everybody of every class. Musk is not working class, but it creates this gender, this masculine identity, which is just like a white identity. It's very similar, the way it works. So that's why they target gender studies, because they don't want you to take classes where you read about gender being used as a mechanism for power. They target critical race theory, because in critical race theory you learn about similar moves you learn about a structure that justifies protests. So when you look at the things they target, you see what the central democratic institutions are, and you see the central concepts. They're trying to ban the concept of fascism because that's what they are, and so they don't want it taught, or they don't want it, around. So this works not just for concepts, but for institutions. So you see, it's just a fact on the ground that you now learn that it's not just, you already knew that the media is a target of fascists and autocrats. You already knew the courts were, but universities are. And that you might not have known. Now you're at, so everybody has to deal with that. We have to start with the ground level fact. Autocrats go after universities as one of their first targets, just like they do the media. And then you're asking me the theoretical question, why? I think there are a bunch of, the most important thing to realize is you have to defend your universities against this kind of anti-woke, whatever they call it in your era. Now I guess it's, woke, anti-wokeness, whatever they call it. You have to defend their universities, or your universities are always going to choose something to go after the universities. So we all have to see that. Now, I guess this means universities are central to democracy. So why are universities central to democracy? They're places of critical inquiry. They're places where you can challenge the status quo. What fascism does is it represents challenges to the status quo as attacks on civilization itself. And so universities are places where you can attack you can criticize the status quo. So you might disagree with some of those criticisms, and that's fine, but there are places where you go, ever since not just Descartes, Plato talks about the cave. You're born with certain illusions, and the whole purpose of philosophy, which is, by the way, the most central topic in any university. I'm saying that completely objectively, but the purpose of philosophy, the purpose of inquiry, the purpose of wisdom is to challenge the cave, is to see what's an illusion. And what you need for fascism, as we began by discussing, is one big illusion.
But it hasn't been just, fascist or authoritarian politics that have started this crackdown against universities in the US. Of course, during the Biden administration, we saw militarized police actions on campus against student protesters. We saw inquiries. And in Australia, under our so-called left or centrist government, we've also had crackdowns. We've had a number of inquiries into universities, government interference with research grants of Palestinian academics. In what way do those sorts of actions pave the way for authoritarian regimes? And what should we be thinking about now in Australia, where we have, a government that's willing to engage in these sorts of attacks?
Well, why don't you answer that question? Yeah. Obviously, that's the Mark Lamont Hill, except for Palestine. Like, we have democracy except for Palestine. So, and of course, these are not, what you have in the Jewish community is as we were discussing earlier, before we came on, a generational dispute between Jewish people. Like, around 40% of American Jews under 40 think Israel is an apartheid state. So what they're saying, and this is why you are so important, Jewish people who are like, actually, what Judaism stands for is social justice. This is a long tradition in our group, the Bund, and there's a long tradition of anti-Zionist Judaism in 20th century Europe. And Hitler talks about that conflict between anti-Zionist Jews and Zionist Jews. And of course, the Nazi Party was pro-Zionist until 1936, because they wanted Jews out of Germany. So there's that conflict, and what we find is that there is, that's why it's anti-Semitic to say that Jewish people have to be for what's going on in Gaza, because it's saying that my people are for this ethno-nationalist authoritarian genocide, and that's what's anti-Semitic. So this is being cynically used, cynically weaponized as a crackdown. And then when you have that, really what the Trump regime is interested in is cracking down on protest. And so lots of them don't really care about Israel, except insofar as Israel is part of this global Netanyahu, Putin. One time I was in Ukraine and speaking to a Ukrainian politician, and he said, "You think that we admire Putin the most in Eastern Europe? Our Eastern European autocrats admire Putin the most. No, we admire Netanyahu. They admire Netanyahu the most because they don't understand why people think Israel is a democracy when he's ruled for, a lot of your life." How long has he been in power over the? So that what we've done is we've allowed a consensus when public opinion is so divorced from what politicians are saying. Public opinion, even Jewish public opinion, is so divorced from this. It's generational. Obviously, my mother, as we were speaking before, my mother has very different views than I do. And my students are even more critical than I've been for a long time. But this gets represented, but this is a little authoritarian pocket. I forget who I was listening to who was like, 3% of people in Congress have called this a genocide, and yet there's an enormous percentage of Americans who think it's a genocide. So that enables you, it gives you a window where you can say, okay, we can crack down on protests, using this as an example. We can crack down on speech, even if we don't care at all about this issue. We can use it, leverage it, to crack down on the inevitable protests when we in power all think something and everyone and most citizens think something else, because we already have done this.
And this, and you've spoken about this as well, the danger that comes when Jews are placed at the center of these debates.
It's never good for us to be in the news. So this is, being used in this way is historically, and what it's doing, it's suggesting that we control the institutions. And of course, it's manipulated by, I'm just waiting, not that this moment is about us, it's about Palestinians, it's about Palestinian survival, Palestinian voices. But I'm really worried this is going to lead to a huge wave of anti-Semitism that will then be again exploited by the far right, because they'll say, see what happened? When you tried to cross the Jews, they destroyed Harvard. My colleague Naftali Kaminsky my former colleague at Yale, the chair of pulmonology at Yale, has a Haaretz piece called "Wait Till They Blame the Jews for the Destruction of Harvard."
And because it's been so successful,
yeah.
Really, this particular narrative, which you sort of place within this strand of fascist impulses, is turning out to be quite successful. And the US is sort of it's much further down the road than where we are. But even here, we have seen institutions start to give in to those, I guess, fascist pressures and impulses. And I wanted to ask, what do you think? Because we're not at the stage where we're not at the Harvard stage yet, or the Yale stage. Academics aren't leaving. But what should institutions be doing in these moments when there are these impulses to, and there is this pressure to sort of to sort of preemptively concede freedoms.
Yeah, I mean, we're focusing on universities, but what you see in the United States is the destruction of all the democratic institutions. The media is under terrible, terrible attack. You know, you saw, you know, the Charlie Kirk moment was used to attack the media. Karen Attiah, the last Black opinion columnist for the Washington Post, was fired for utterly innocuous posts. And you know, I just want to move from the universities to the media because it's really a 5-alarm fire right now in US media. So a bunch of us have been talking about this in January. We're like, well, who's going to buy the media? Because that's what Putin's Russia did. That's what Orban did. They get they have their oligarchs. The autocrats own oligarchs, and then the oligarchs they give the oligarchs they own state contracts, and then the oligarchs buy up the media. So this happened in Russia, happened in Hungary. Now it's happening in the United States. And it's weird because I knew it would happen. You know, I remember talking to Mehdi Hassan, and he was like, you don't even need a rich oligarch. You can get, you know, but Larry Ellison, you know, Trump's closest oligarch, he bought CBS, which is like the Harvard of legacy TV, 60 Minutes, you know, Edward Murrow, who took Joe McCarthy down. So you go after Harvard, you go after CBS, you go after the flagship institutions. Larry Ellison has purchased CBS. He's putting Barry Weiss in charge as the editor-in-chief. He bought her Substack for $150 million. I hope some left-wing dictator buys my Substack for that much. I'd even go for $75 million. But I just started a Substack last week. My kids begged me to. So the media is being purchased. Larry Ellison is now going to buy CNN. So CNN, TikTok will be purchased by, looks like Lachlan Murdoch and Larry Ellison. I'm including David Ellison under the Ellison family. These are all, so the media is going down one by one by one. So each of these, Masha Gessen said this in Sydney, and this is something that I saw even at Yale. Like, it was funny. Like in mid-September, I was talking to a friend, and I was like, "It seems to me that the mood in the United States has dramatically changed, and everyone is trying to avoid becoming a target of Trump." And my friend was like, "Jason, you left 2 weeks ago." But that is happening. When I went to the dean at Yale and said I was leaving, the dean of humanities, he said, "You know, you're completely safe here. You know, we've talked about this. We know this. You're completely safe." And now the way my former colleagues were saying that, they were like, "You're completely safe." And now when I talk to them, they're getting angry at Yale faculty members who are like, "Oh, she's such a jerk. She's bringing attention to Yale. She's like trying to, you know, get Trump mad at us." And I'm like, "Well, you told me I'd be safe, and now your attitude is, your loyalty is to Yale. Your loyalty is to not to democracy, but to your institution." And that's what Gessen said in Sydney. They said, what you're finding is that each institution is saying, well, we want to survive this moment. It's not democracy that has to survive. It's the Washington Post. It's the New York Times. I mean, the New York Times is like professionally normalizing the situation. Everybody wants their institution to survive. And I saw that at Yale. Even the people even my colleagues and I loved being at Yale. I was there for 12 years. I was in the faculty senate for many years. I started to really love the institution. But then I realized, like, that's how they get you. You start to think about the survival of the institution and not, you know, and actually you're contributing to the destruction of the institution, because the institution is a central democratic institution. And so when you preserve it, but that's how people are thinking now. They're thinking, I'm gonna preserve the New York Times, make sure Trump doesn't go after the New York Times. I'm gonna preserve Yale, by keeping us under the radar. They're going after Harvard. So that's what you have to avoid. You have to avoid thinking about your individual institution as something where, you're successful if you protect it rather than democracy.
I mean, what's the, I guess not everyone can leave, obviously.
I've heard that before.
Yeah. But what's the opposite of the anticipatory obedience? How do individuals within these institutions resist, or institutions themselves resist? Like what can they do in the face of this very severe repression that's coming their way?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of friends in media, obviously in the universities, who are facing this question. One thing that Russian journalists did is that, because when you're asked to morally compromise, like take MSNBC, who was asked. I mean, I think Washington Post wanted to get rid of Karen Attiah anyway because they had focused on cleaning out everyone who wasn't writing about free markets and personal liberties. But MSNBC had to fire one of their contributors, Matthew Dowd, for saying something obviously true after the terrible Charlie Kirk assassination. And these moments of moral compromise come quickly. So one thing that Russian journalists have done is they write down their principles in advance, and they hand a letter to their friends. They write their red lines down, and then when they're asked to compromise, you can go back, because in the moment it's difficult. So have red lines. Obviously, another thing, I think, not as members of an institution, the other thing I would say is do your job. Your job as a journalist is to tell the truth. So do your job. Your job as a teacher is to teach, is to explore ideas, challenge students' perspectives. That's your job as a teacher. If everybody just does their job in a democracy, things will work out fine. So don't let them pervert what your institution is about. You went into your job to do a particular job. Continue doing that job. And the other thing is, there needs to be, like what we saw with Jimmy Kimmel, there was a mass societal rejection of the propaganda line the regime was trying to shove down Americans' throats. Everybody just made fun of them, and that kind of worked. So if everybody just joins together and if you look at Gavin Newsom seems to be really good at social media, and so they just were announcing that if you call them fascists, then they're going to say you're supporting terrorism. So Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, just started ridiculing Stephen Miller on his social media, showing Stephen Miller getting his feet washed and fascist. The first post was showing Stephen Miller in some fascist pose or something, and Stephen Miller's office wrote, "Why are you doing this?" And Gavin Newsom wrote back, "Because you're a fascist." So that kind of total societal refusal to go along is central.
Because it's sort of disrupting the alternative narrative, which is the emotional manipulation through propaganda, this sort of control and punishment. And you spoke about Toni Morrison, this sort of idea that you can write off certain segments of the population as being outside and as being deserving of the punishments that then get meted out. And this requires a sort of social acceptance of that.
And the kind of cruelty, what you're seeing in the United States is a kind of performative cruelty. I think you guys do performative cruelty with immigration too, right? So performative cruelty is very dangerous because performative cruelty to one group. And this is what they did to us. And I mean, Kristallnacht was trying to arresting a whole bunch of Jews and treating them brutally in order to get them to self-deport. And that is explicitly what they're doing with immigrants in the United States. And now, predictably, you see they're turning to US citizens. So if you will, and this is the old structure of the theory of fascism that you find in like Césaire and Du Bois and Arendt. It starts off with colonialism. You do something brutal to people over there. And then you can do it, then you can broaden it. It's like you're like, hey, we're used to brutal things. So, you know, you perform a genocide, you have slavery, and then you're like, hey, you know, we're used to this, we're just broadening it to our political opposition.
What's the, I guess you speak about as well in erasing history that, you know, a lot of scholars speak about fascism as requiring a material basis, as having, you know, economic crises, military defeat, political loss, that these things are all essential to creating that sort of emotional pull and sense of grievance as well that is so associated with fascist politics. And we see it, you know, you mentioned the men's rights movement, that sense of grievance is really crucial to it. And I guess, you know, I guess the question is like, to what extent are these sort of grievances real grievances, and in what ways are they are they connected to the failures of liberal democracies to meet people's basic needs, you know, these unfulfilled promises of equality?
Yeah, great and deep question that we won't be able to address in the several minutes remaining to us. I mean, I think, and I'm more and more getting to see this also thanks to my colleague Robin Dembroff. They have a book coming out, Real Men on Top, that is really good on the issue of, you know, men are victims of patriarchy. You know, the grievance of the structure of patriarchy tells men they should be a certain thing, and that thing is a very painful thing to be, and if they're not that thing, then they also feel lost. So it's important to see we're all victims. All of these structures. I mean, that's what Du Bois is saying in Black Reconstruction. He's saying poor whites are the victims of are victims of racism too, because, you know, the racism, you know, the Reconstruction ends because the rich people the rich whites are like, damn, the poor whites and the poor blacks are getting together in a labor movement. We got to split them apart. Let's use race. So gender is used in the same way. So you know, you're a victim of these structures that tell you that you should get benefits just because you're in a group. So now what we're seeing in the current moment, in the discussion to which you avert, and there definitely are material conditions. There was material conditions in the United States, the financial crisis. Obama was a big hope. He campaigned as a progressive, and then he came in and he put Timothy Geithner as the Treasury Secretary, who was the Fed chief in New York in 2005, 2006, under the worst moments of the bank malfeasance. So he was supposed to be the referee, and he failed the worst of everyone, so he got to be in charge. And then Larry Summers was put as the person directing everyone, and he was the chiefly responsible for deregulating the banks under Clinton. And then they gave trillions of dollars to the banks rather than American citizens. And this was normal I mean, not that bankers aren't citizens, but you know, this was a tremendous failure. And obviously that has repercussions, but the Marxist analysis that wants to say it's all economic, I challenge that in the book. I say, actually, there are ideological preconditions. The ideological preconditions in the United States, you find this in the education literature on Nazi Germany, where they talk about the Nazis didn't really have to do much with the textbooks under Weimar, because the textbooks under Weimar already said that Germany was the greatest country in history. And the textbooks that I read, you know, I mean, I remember once my first time speaking in Ukraine in 2017, and I was speaking on fascism. I was like, oh, you know, fascism is when you say my country is the greatest country in history, and then someone raised their hand and was like, but your President Obama always went on saying America is the greatest country in history. So these ideological preconditions, you know, the founding fathers are the greatest men in history. The country is the greatest country in history. These are ideological preconditions, they're not material, that enable fascist politics. It enables you to say, look, if the white enslavers who founded America were the greatest men in history, then immigration is an existential threat.
I want to go to the audience questions, and they're on Slido, and there's one that really relates to what you were just talking about. You know, and this person says, as a politics and history teacher, how do you recommend teaching the past and contemporary political situation to students factually, given the rise of fascism? But I think also, you know, how do you teach that history that is not infused with these ideas of nationalism that so give rise to fascist politics?
Right, you have to avoid the mythical past. You know, you have to avoid whitewashing the past. I mean, it's really tricky. I wish I could say that if you do that, you'll be fine. But Germany, which has bragged to the world about how great it is facing its past, which was always bullshit. Sorry, I shouldn't say that if there are kids present. But still, Germany kind of prided itself on facing its past more than most other countries. And they now have the biggest fascist party that, you know, the Alternative für Deutschland is the most popular, polls the highest of any party in Germany, and is the most extreme far-right party in Europe. So that's a real problem. It's sort of a conceptual problem for what I'm saying in the book, which is like, if you face your past, you'll be okay. It's clearly not sufficient, but I think it's necessary. You know, a democracy is based around the values of equality and freedom. And you know, freedom means recognizing everybody's perspective, giving them a space to have a perspective. And so a democracy involves an education system where you learn about your fellow citizens' perspectives. You learn about, and then you're trying to drive towards equality, so you're trying to overcome the inequalities of the past. But if you don't know about the inequalities of the past, if you don't know what led to those inequalities, then you cannot realize the democratic values of freedom and equality. If you don't know the perspectives of your fellow citizens, you can't allow them a space of freedom. So if you're a teacher in a democracy, I mean, if you're a teacher in fascism, I have a whole bunch of other recommendations as to what you ought to do. But I can teach people to be teachers in fascism, good. But you know, Hitler talks about this. Hitler says, you know, we in Germany have forgotten the method of, the true method of teaching, which is to teach about the great men of the dominant race. So you want to do the opposite of that. You also want to give people agency. You want to show, so these are familiar points from Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, and Howard Zinn. You want to teach in a way that tells people ordinary citizens have been drivers of change. You can do things. If you teach history as just the exploits of great men, what you're telling people is that ordinary citizens in social movements can't do anything. So a democratic education requires you to pay attention to movements, leaderless movements of ordinary people.
I guess, I mean, and you've partially answered this. Another person, you know, speaks about the fact that globally in this moment, I mean, we all know globally we're seeing the rise of far-right parties, and you've said democracy's in decline. But it's also true that centre-left and establishment parties seem incapable of providing an alternative narrative to emerging fascist movements and parties. You know, I think we've seen a little bit of that in Australia, although there was a resounding defeat of our more right-wing party at the last election. But still, you've said in a recent Guardian article that you think Australia is, you know, potentially next in the global sort of shift towards fascism. What is it about our centre-left governments that is failing in this moment?
Well, I think, so I just said that I'm profoundly ignorant of Australian politics. I just went from the basic thing that you had a white Australia policy until the 70s, which seems kind of late. And you have the history of indigenous genocide. So those are, those are general features, and you can overcome them with a democratic society. And, my 6 days in Australia have been, people seem very defensive when I say Australia might be next. So that's good. It's good to be defensive. It's good to, for me, my role is to say you might be next, because everybody might be next. So, and you do have these structural features that make you very vulnerable. But you also have the good fortune, like Canada, to have Donald Trump as someone you don't like. So now I think that the face of the fascist movement is this anti-woke thing lately. So which is not to say that, you need a broad tent. You need a broad tent. So you have to fight this situation where the center left has to fight. And maybe it's not left, right. I prefer to think of things as authoritarians versus Democrats. You actually do need social conservatives in a pro-democracy movement. This is why we have a social conservative running against Orban in Hungary. You just have to, you somehow have to have solidarity. I think there's this thing that the left is so powerless that the only time they feel like they can have a victory is when they crush another leftist group. And that's understandable, I get it, but that has to end. Simultaneously, there's groups of people who who are incredibly vulnerable in this moment, particularly, I would say, trans people, who are being harshly scapegoated in the most brutal possible way. And so the last thing you can do is add to their fear and terror by abandoning them, by saying, okay, in order to, move in fight authoritarianism, we're going to have to throw you over the board. That is the most cruel thing imaginable. So, but somehow you're going to have to create a movement for democracy. Stop calling it left and right. Just say, and this is what you see. You see it in Hungary. You see it in Turkey to some extent. People just being like, we're sick of, because these far-right parties are just fronts for oligarchs, billionaires, and corruption. So, they're just using the cultural politics for that. So, get people committed to democracy. Say, we want to just not be responsive to this anti-woke panic anymore. We're going to see it for the charade it is. We're going to call out the useful dupes who are like, oh, we're going to have, there's cancel culture, and then who are just, the useful dupes are just fronts for the far-right movements. They're like, and just say, okay, we all have to collectively be against authoritarianism, and we'll deal with all the disagreement later.
I'll end with a question that maybe is a little bit more hopeful, because there's a lot of, how can we reclaim social justice principles and language when they are so perverted, and how can we reclaim the language of democracy if that's what we're trying to mobilize people around? Right.
So free speech being a great example where, we had, 20 in the United States, 2015, 2016, 2017, or even, up to now, you had the useful dupes saying, oh, look, the LGBTQ citizens and and black students, they're challenging free speech because they're criticizing us. But they never talked about Palestine, never. Steven Pinker never mentioned Palestine. It was only black students, who were criticizing scientific racism, and they chilled free speech. So I think you have to call out the contradictions. You have to call out the hypocrisies. You have to, as you have done in your work in Australia, call out the anti-democratic gaps. And you have to say, you know, we are the ones who represent these democratic values. The free speech warriors are the people who stand up for student protesters.
I might leave it there because that I think was a more positive note to end on. But thank you so much, Jason, for all your work.
Thank you,
it's really
Sarah.
important in this moment.
Likewise.